Hello.
I am back with an iced coffee and another side project. This is Career Matcha. It's essentially a database of career paths, kind of like LinkedIn, but more useful in my opinion. But this video isn't about the whole project, but it's specifically about how I did end-to-end testing with Playwright, GitHub Actions, and Vercel to build sort of a CI/CD workflow, and especially how I got around the problems with Next Authentication and the Google service provider. This isn't exactly a tutorial, but I made this A, hopefully to help someone else who's stuck, and B, showcase what I've done, maybe get some feedback. Let's jump right in. Bit of a recap. By end-to-end testing, I mean the top layer of that testing pyramid. You're actually testing UI components. You're clicking buttons to see if they do what you want it to do, see if things look the way they're supposed to on the web page. So that requires actually handling the UI. That's one layer above integration testing when you're doing things like testing connections to databases and APIs, for example, but you're not actually clicking on the UI. And that itself is one layer above unit testing when you're just testing individual functions to see how they work. And end-to-end testing Career Matcha would be very straightforward if there was no authentication. Because this landing page, it's publicly available. You can just write some code to access this page and then it would just test the buttons to see if they work. But there is this aspect of having to log in with Google that does start causing issues. Because the bulk of the platform is authenticated, you have to somehow get Playwright to authenticate itself and then start clicking buttons in this automated way to test to see if things work. And of course, Playwright's thought of this. You can write setup scripts that run before all the tests. So this is an example of a GitHub login setup. You can get it to fill in your username, password, signs in, and then it saves the authenticated state for that session in a JSON that you can then use as your authenticated state when you run tests that require authenticated pages. The problem is that Google doesn't like this headless login. There are some workarounds. There are some ways you can fake this automated behavior so that it doesn't seem like it's coming from a computer. But honestly, I couldn't really figure out how to do it. And that's a problem for me because all I used in terms of authentication was the Google service provider. So I used the most finicky workaround. I logged in once manually. I used Playwright to save that authenticated state as a JSON, keep it locally. Then I can run these tests locally using this authenticated state. I'll show you how I did that in a second. But I just want to make things clear. It means I can run things locally, but then I can't put this auth.json on GitHub because that exposed some spooky things that I don't want to have up there. So would this work in real life? No, you would have to come up with another way. But does that mean you can still test things and have somewhat of a CI/CD workflow? Yeah, maybe. To make it clearer, here's what I did. I started my local server, I use port 3002. I run the CodeGen emulator, and I have this flag for saving the storage state. Inside the emulator, I then sign in. Once I exit out of that, it saves the authenticated state to that auth.json, which I can then use in my other tests. So let's do that. Start the local server. So it fires up the emulator, and I want to sign in now. So now that I'm signed in, if I exit this, I have a new file created, auth.example.json, because that's what I had here. I have some cookies, I have my local storage state in there. And now I can go into my playwright.config.js and set it so that every test uses this storage state of auth.example.json. Now I can run npx playwright test as you'd expect. And my tests have passed. One of them is flaky, but that's just more due to how I implemented it. And you can probably see this in the config file, but I use this environment variable auth as a flag to toggle between using the authenticated state and not. So when I run it using GitHub Actions, I have this environment variable set to 1. That's the flag that says, do not use the authenticated state. You'll just run the landing page test. Which again, in reality, isn't that useful, but it's just my workaround so that I could at least test things locally. You can see these flags in action. I've changed the auth environment variable locally to 1, which is the do not use the authenticated state flag that GitHub Actions reads. And you can see the difference in the number of tests that pass, or the number of tests that are skipped rather. We skipped 18 and we passed 10 of them. Whereas with the flag as 0, we skipped 5 of them and 22 passed. And to get each test file to skip authenticated test depending on that flag, you can see here this is my navbar desktop.spec.js file. And I have this test.skip when the authenticated or when the auth variable equals 1. And so what this does is that it skips all the tests in this file. And the final part is seeing how it runs with GitHub Actions. I've set it up so that the tests only run when you open a PR to main. and it becomes one of the checks that determines whether the PR will auto-merge or not. The other ones are whether the preview deployment on Vercel works, and when those conditions are satisfied, it just auto-deploys to main.